name is Tatiana Linkoeva. I'm an associate professor of history here at NYU. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Robert Cruz from Stanford University. Right? Professor Cruz is a scholar of global history and politics with a focus on Afghanistan, Central Asia, Russia, South Asia, and Islam. So he's the author of numerous books and articles. His latest work, Afghan Modern, The History of a Global Nation, was published in 2015 by Harvard University Press. And many of us here today, including me, first became acquainted with Professor Cruz's work through his book, For Prophet and Tsar, Islam and Empire in Russia and Central Asia, published also by Harvard University Press in 2006. I read your book.
Sorry. My apologies.
And today, Professor Cruz will talk about the mobilization of the Muslim population and the role of Islam in Russia since Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year. So thank you, Professor Cruz, for coming all the way from California. And yes, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you. Lovely to see some old friends, or friends I've met a long time, not old friends, just friends of many years. I'm trying to rip the crowd here to start up. Thanks to Sasha Pelnik for setting us up, and thank you especially to Dr. Tatiana Linkoeva, who's invited me now, not once, but twice to NYU, and I'm finally able to make it this time, so thank you for your generosity. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks in advance for this opportunity to talk about a topic that I'm wrestling with, extremely complicated, and there'll be time at the end where you can help me sort this out. I look forward to your feedback, and I'll have some possible frameworks to think about this, but I'm eager to hear more about whether or not you think they work and to see alternative explanations potentially. So to start, obviously this is Putin's war, this broad agreement, what everyone thinks about its origins, among experts and casual observers alike, that this is Putin's war. But what about the rest of Russian society? Are they zealous perpetrators? Are they indifferent or innocent bystanders, powerless victims? Or are they some combination of all of these elements? How does the Russian war machine actually function in relation to Russian society? First, the kind of elephant in the room, the most talked about phenomenon, the most important kind of ideological platform of this war has been this notion of a kind of Russian world, a kind of mythical world in which the space stretching from Russia to some indefinite border in Ukraine is to be consolidated by Moscow under the kind of rubric of Orthodox Christianity in a way that denies, of course, the existence of a distinctive Ukrainian nationality. But this angle has received a lot of attention and has contributed to a particular framing of the war. The idea that Russia, as a state with a lengthy imperial history, should not just be defeated, but also effectively decolonized and broken apart. This is one such prescription for Moscow's aggression. And this Atlantic piece of May 2022 got a lot of press. Obviously, it's not the only way to think about this, but if you've been on the internet in the last year and a half or so, you've also probably seen images like this in which NATO spokespeople have argued for essentially the fragmentation of the Russian Federation as one of the war aims. That is not just the expulsion of Russian forces from Ukraine, but something broader to end Russia once and for all as a threat to Ukraine, Eastern Europe, and indeed the world. And Muslims obviously play a very central role in this kind of imagination because of the geography, because there are so many Muslim territories, or territories in which there are substantive Muslim populations. So in this scenario, really, Muslims are kind of the front lines to be targeted, in particular, for liberation from what is often referred to as the Russian yoke. But it's crucial here at the outset to note that this idea is not a new one. It did not emerge after February 22nd. In fact, it's a quite old idea. It's one that, as Tatiana Linkoeva mentioned, was the subject of the book I wrote about Russian Islam. Really, the idea has its origins as early as the 18th century. This idea that Russian Muslims are potentially disloyal and might potentially be won over to an enemy power, perhaps the Ottoman Empire or another power. This idea really sustained Russian imperial policy through the 19th century. During the First World War, Berlin took it up as an opportunity to turn Russia's Muslims, in particular prisoners of war, against the Russian imperial army. The Nazi regime reinvigorated this idea in 1941 and actually targeted Russia's Soviet Muslims for recruitment. In fact, in the Cold War, this idea persisted as well. And so many of our forefathers in Cold War kind of nationality studies also saw Muslims as a kind of Achilles heel or a kind of fifth column. They looked at the results of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and looked at the very strong birth rates among Muslim populations, imagined that were the Soviet Union to collapse, Muslims would be at the fore. So there's this long kind of underdog narrative in which we positioned Russia's Muslims, Soviet Muslims, and now post-Soviet Muslims. In the 1990s, much of this focus shifted to radical organizations, Islamist groups in the Middle East, who also saw, especially in the Caucasus, areas where they might recruit radicals, especially in the 1990s when there were a number of political movements to secede from Moscow. And then most recently, the Islamic State has sent recruiters to the Caucasus and elsewhere seeking people to join forces with them at the expense of Moscow. So since Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, many of these ideas have gathered new steam, and many of the debates circling around Russia's Muslims today really focus on two major themes. One is that they are, many critics argue, essentially cannon fodder now. Muslims are, in particular, in this view, cannon fodder of Putin's brutal war against Ukraine. A companion view is that, in fact, Muslims are essentially a vanguard, a sleeping vanguard, waiting, poised to lead the dissolution of this Russian empire. So in both cases, Muslims are imagined to play a key part in the war. But what's less talked about, from my point of view, is the reality of these obituary pages here, which is that Russian Muslims of all different nationalities and ethnicities in the Russian Federation are in fact today killing Ukrainians and being killed. So they are in fact crucial to the war effort. All of which brings me to one of the most striking paradoxes of contemporary Russia, and that is really in this figure, Ramzan Kadyrov, a Muslim political leader who represents Chechnya, the one region of the Russian Federation that produced a large oppositional fighting force that sought to break away from Moscow in the 1990s. He now has emerged as one of the most high-profile propagandists for war, selling Russia's war against Ukraine as a cause that serves Islam. So obviously the shift in Chechen politics from being a revolutionary force opposing Moscow to now, in the figure of Kadyrov, being the strongest propagandist and advocate of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But it goes beyond Kadyrov, in fact, because Muslims of diverse national and ethnic backgrounds are playing such a role as frontline combat troops. And then crucially, as I'll talk about today, Muslim clerics, that is those who are the kind of self-professed Muslim scholars and elites who represent these communities in the religious sphere, have strongly backed Vladimir Putin's war. And they have now been tasked with trying to rally support among Russia's estimated 20 million plus Muslims, who make up something like 40% of the overall population of the Russian Federation. So one of my aims here today is to really help us understand that the idea with which I began about a Russia world marked by orthodoxy is just one narrative that the Kremlin uses to attempt to justify its war of aggression in Ukraine. And the crucial question for me is to try to understand how Muslims are mobilized. That is, how they are invited to engage with the war along a spectrum which ranges from passive acquiescence to fervent enthusiasm. So that's the kind of spectrum of activity that I'm trying to chart here. Now, of course, I can't generalize about all Muslims in the Russian Federation. There's more than 20 million people. So I'm going to focus here today on those who are the self-identified religious leaders who've had the most to say about the war since February of 2022. And here, for analytical purposes, I will highlight three different groups, or three categories of people who are all elites, who are all intellectuals, who claim to speak in an authoritative way about Islam and about Russian politics in some manner. So the first group that I'll focus on is what we might call the established clerical elites, or the kind of Russian clerical establishment, all of whom enjoy some degree of state backing. Now, they're not entirely a monolith. They are actually a somewhat within this range of people. They hold different views. They have different geographic bases, some in Moscow, some in Kazan in Tatarstan, some in Grozny in Chechnya. And I would include Ramzan Kadyrov, whom we just met in this category, though he's not a cleric. He's not a cleric, but he positions himself explicitly as a religious leader who claims to speak for Islam. Now, Kadyrov is so important because he grounds his arguments in religion, in Islam, and simultaneously he grounds them in nationalist, or perhaps more accurately, a kind of binationalist ideology, that is Russian and Chechen blended together. So he speaks a kind of vocabulary which is Islamic, Russian, and Chechen all at once. And indeed, arguably, Chechnya is really the geographic center of this network of support for the war. And as a good Muslim, as a good layperson without clerical training, Ramzan Kadyrov defers to the senior religious cleric in Chechnya, Salah Majiev, who is the mufti of the Chechen Republic, who in the first days of the war declared it a jihad, arguing Chechen soldiers were fighting for God, for the Quran, and to save Russia and Islam from filth spread by NATO. And this is Mufti Najiev. The second category of people that we'll be looking at more closely are the diaspora religious scholars, mostly based in the Middle East, who are almost exclusively exiles from the Caucasus, mostly from the North Caucasus, who are, importantly, critics of the Kremlin. They're critics of the war, they are opponents of the official Islamic establishment, and generally are quite critical of Russian society and culture across the board. We'll meet them in a moment as well. Finally, a third category, which I think is actually the most interesting and I think the most challenging to analyze, to get a kind of analytical read on, are a group of people we might call new intellectuals. These include men, but very importantly, women who are Russophone, that is, they're Russian speakers. Some are binational. Some have one foot in Central Asia, some in places like Moscow and Petersburg, who claim expertise in Islam in a number of interesting ways. They tend to bridge several fields, distinct fields of study and learning and of profession. Some are experts in the Islamic religious sciences in a more kind of conventional, traditional sense, but others have branched out into Islamic finance. And some, importantly, we'll see are more interested in what I would call, or I will call, something like prosperity gospel. That is kind of day-to-day, how to succeed in life kinds of teachings, which they blend with Islam. So the one kind of leg is Islamic finance, and others simply how to make it as a kind of, if you like, neoliberal subject of our globalized world. Another thread of this engagement is through fashion, the halal fashion industry. And finally, a really interesting sphere of activity in which particularly women are active, which is psychology, which ranges from child development to broadly kind of self-help. And the self-help literature and discourse overlaps, of course, with how to make it in life, how to be successful, how to have a sound domestic base at home, how to have good gender roles, and of course, make money. So this last sphere of activity, the one highlighting here, appropriately, I think this photograph is my favorite of all these, it explicitly rejects the notion that this is a society of war. This is a kind of escapist discourse. Here, elites imagine a kind of utopia, blending piety and prosperity, a modern, globalized aesthetic, and cosmopolitan consumerism. And as we'll see, one way to be a Muslim in Russia in 2023 is to engage in buying certain things, in appearing a certain way, in being visible in a certain way with a certain aesthetic. So there's a very strong kind of cosmopolitan consumerist ethos to this. Finally, this third category of thinkers is broadly committed to the propagation of a unique neo-traditionalism, which highlights the importance of performing particular gender roles and elevates a modern politics of domesticity in which women act as professionalized Muslim mothers. And as we'll see, this isn't traditionalism per se. This isn't something that already exists. This is a project that is in the making. It's something that's being cultivated, that's being brought into being by the efforts of these intellectuals. So it's not essentially taking Muslims as they are, it's remaking them in a kind of neo-traditionalist fashion. So new media are absolutely essential to each of these groups, but especially to the last two categories, that is the dissident diaspora and the new intellectuals. And here there's a brilliant site which offers lessons online, and truly I think sums up much of this knowledge production, which is that the internet is now the madrasa or the madrasa. The internet is now the Islamic college, the Islamic school. So for more and more, especially young and female Muslims in Russia, the internet is where one builds up one's knowledge about the tradition. And this is a very competitive sphere now, we'll see, because each of the groups I'm describing here are all online, all active on social media, and all competing with one another to speak for Islam in Russia. But before meeting these characters, let's pause to take a look at the pre-war landscape of Islam in Russia, whose key features include, and remain really, first of all, state patronage of Islamic authorities and institutions. So you see the geographic extent of Russian communities really spread across a vast space. And here, this is my homemade map. Forgive me, it's somewhat crude, but you see a cluster of communities, of course, in the North Caucasus. but also in the capitals, Petersburg, Moscow, Kazan, really to the east and the far north, and Siberia, and really throughout. What's not represented here, these are the major mosques, but with a very large Central Asian Muslim migrant community in all major cities. There are Muslims really in every town of any kind of size across the Russian Federation. So there is no compact base of settlement for Muslims in the Russian Federation. So the state is acted as a kind of guardian of certain kinds of Islamic religious authorities, and these are centralized to an extent. They're based on regions, but the Kremlin has been careful to not allow one single center to emerge. So this is one common element shared with the imperial period. That is a degree of centralization, but there's also an element of sustaining competition that is not allowing one central figure to emerge. So state and religious authorities in day-to-day practice across the country cooperate in policing Muslim religiosity. Now, the state recognizes something called traditional religion, traditional Islam, alongside Judaism, Buddhism, and certain Protestant communities as historically traditional Russian religions. So in that sense, Islam enjoys broad toleration, but within particular limits that have to do with Russia's modern history. Many Muslim clerics share a very similar view and are hostile to new kinds of what they would call innovations entering from beyond the borders of the Russian state. So to a significant extent, we can talk about Islam being securitized in the Russian Empire. That is, something that's heavily policed, monitored. And these images, I think, are quite striking to see mosques being surveilled, prayers being accompanied by armed police figures. And really broadly, if one thinks of the history of the last 30 years, when Moscow attempted to wrest the Chechen Republic, to turn it back to the fold of the Russian Federation in the 1990s after a brief independence movement there. Really, from that moment in the 1990s, there have been moments of violence in which, of course, the state engaged in repression against Muslims that thought were hostile to the state. And then militant strategies evolved too. And so by the early 2000s, many militants in the Caucasus decided that they would take their war to the major cities of Russia. So if you look back and review all cases of what the Russian state called terrorism in the 2000s, these were attacks on theaters, on airplanes, on trains, on infrastructure in major urban settings across Russia in the 2000s. So of course, the Russian security forces have been very attuned to monitoring those activities and preventing any recurrence. At the same time, there is censorship. So again, there is broad toleration for Islam in certain ways, as defined by a kind of confluence of interest between these official authorities and the police. But for example, last year in Tatarstan, a very kind of canonical important text, a collection of the sayings and acts of the Prophet, Bukhari's collection of these acts and sayings, the Sahih al-Bukhari, was banned by a local court in Tatarstan, which of course created a lot of tension. It was something very hard for the accepted official authorities to come to terms with, because it was pretty clearly a deviation from prior practice. But a local Orientalist scholar decided that in Bukhari's Hadith collection, there was some kind of extremist content which legitimated violence against the Russian state. So that is still working its way through the courts. One also finds instances of not just censorship of different texts, but local schools banning the hijab in some settings, in some contexts. So that's another frequent occurrence. But importantly, this happens at the local level and rarely makes its way to a national press, except in Muslim channels, and then it's adjudicated. So again, there are tensions around kind of Islamophobia and discrimination, but broadly, the federal position is to tolerate all these practices. But there are limits. So one point of agreement for the established clerics in the state is that Salafis are largely beyond the pale. Those are, here in this context, intellectuals who imagine that their mission is to return the flock essentially to the idealized practice of the Prophet Muhammad and his contemporaries, who dressed a particular way, who wore particular beards, and engaged in particular forms of piety, which should be emulated in the present. And because these Salafi movements were linked to opposition in the 1990s in the Caucasus, they've been marked for repression, again, both by the state and by these official clerical authorities who are close to it. Importantly, this is not the whole story. It's not just about domestic politics and kind of giving sanction for Kremlin politics. As in the Tsarist and Soviet periods, Muslim clerics play a key role as intermediaries with other Islamic leaders. And particularly since Russia's intervention in Syria, the role of Muslim clerics has really grown more important, arguably, in dealing with Turkey and Syria and Iran. So you have state visitors who from Muslim countries who will typically, of course, meet with Putin and meet with politicians, but it's also part of the whole itinerary that they will visit mosques, they will visit the Russian clerical establishment. So again, this is one way in which Islam is crucial to not just domestic politics in Russia, but to Putin's understanding of foreign policy. In a way, again, the backdrop that is crucial for us to remember is that for the last 20 years, of course, the United States, Russia's rival, has been at war in the Middle East and Africa, targeting largely Muslim populations. So obviously this isn't coincidental at all. This is to show the world that on the global stage, Russia is a friend of Islam, the United States is not, to put it very, very crudely. At the same time, as we see from this image, again, one of my favorites for Russian speakers, this is kind of an inside joke, but for those of you who are not, this is an advertisement for Hallmark. So halal products, of course, ripping on our great American institution, Walmart. There's a massive Russian halal industry that has received a very important state investment to assist both Islamic experts and agriculturalists across multiple regions to produce halal products for export to the Middle East, to Asia, and to Africa. And here too, this is inseparable from Russian foreign policy that seeks to form a kind of coalition of states opposed to NATO and the West. And this is yet another avenue to build upon those relationships. So Islamic banking is another realm in which Islamic legal principles are put into play. Halal is another one. There's a massive, not as big as Turkey's, which I think still leads the world, but the Russian halal industry is quite substantive. If you visit places like Kazan, there are whole blocks of shops with lots of stuff done by local designers. So we'll meet some of them in a moment, but this is actually a major, again, a domestic industry, but one that is meant for export. So showing a few slides here to show how the power of Kadyrov and Putin are mutually constitutive and really draw on one another. On the left, we have Kadyrov claiming that Russia is a great power, of course. So Kadyrov, as the representative of a region of the empire that was brutally conquered on multiple occasions, has now, of course, announced that he is very much in solidarity with the broader imperial goals of the state. And then, more to the point, for this theme, Vladimir Putin is shown here in this caption. He's supporting an initiative of Ramzan Kadyrov to develop Islamic banking. And actually, so there's a lot of stuff working through the Duma, the parliament, to make Islamic banking something unique in a non-Muslim majority country. That is something to put it on a kind of global scale, on a world stage, to distinguish it from what many note as, and what these critics especially note, is a kind of climate of Islamophobia in Europe, and then broadly looking at America's imperial wars of the last 20 years, again, to attempt to draw a distinction between certain powers that are friendly to Islam and Muslims and those that are hostile to them. So Islamic banking is another potential wedge here, which is beginning to develop. And here it's notable that it's Putin who is supporting Kadyrov's initiative. Again, Kadyrov is not a cleric, but here he can make the initiative to develop this form of really this translation of Islamic law into a broader practice for Russia's 20 million Muslim subjects. So to add to the picture, as an element of securitization, and if you follow Moscow politics, you've been following this lately, that in places like Moscow, where there's a large population, growing population of Muslims from the Caucasus, Central Asia, there are not enough mosques. There are not enough, there's not enough space for prayers. This is one of the, one moment in the ritual calendar of the Islamic community of Moscow, in which there's simply not enough places to pray to make it inside this mosque. And so this is a common appearance. So plans to build new mosques have been blocked by local neighborhoods in Moscow, and this is ongoing in the summer. Again, the federal government and the Kremlin managed to stay on the side of this and try to kind of stay out of this, but local authorities have protested this. Muslim critics note that the Russian media environment is quite Islamophobic, that there's a lot of kind of mischaracterization of Islam and a lot of association with terrorism and violence. And finally, because so many of these Muslims are migrants, the problem of Islamophobia overlaps here with xenophobia and a kind of anti-immigrant or anti-migrant sentiment. So recently, if you follow Geopolitics, you may have seen commentary about so-called ethnic enclaves in major cities that Russian politicians are now targeting with new legislative measures because they do not want to reproduce what they claim has gone wrong in the West, right? So they explicitly point to Chinatowns and to other ethnic enclaves in Europe and the United States, claiming that this is the path that Russia should not follow. So these must be addressed sooner rather than later. And of course, the primary target here is Muslim migrant populations. So looking at this broad landscape of really just Russia on the eve of the war, it's important to note that Putin is not the central figure in this political scenario. He leans really on the authority of the clerical establishment, and in particular on Kadyrov as a representative of Russia's Muslims, crucially in west of Chechnya, but now increasingly nationally and indeed internationally. And this is apparent in, there have been recent opportunities that Kadyrov has seized upon when news has arrived of European right-wing activists burning the Quran, as they've done in Sweden and Denmark and elsewhere recently. And here in Kadyrov's social media, he notes that we see on the left that these right-wing people burning the Quran in Europe are really not just kind of lone wolves doing their thing. They're in fact instigated by political forces. So in a sense, they represent official policy, in the sense that Europe is innately hostile to Islam. Now, on the right, he argues quite dramatically, and this dovetails with the language justifying war in Ukraine, is that there's no doubt, Kadyrov argues here, that almost all European countries are followers of Satanism. So burning the Quran makes one a Satanist, makes one anti-Muslim, vis-a-vis those domestic populations of Europe, but also against Russia's Muslims, and indeed against global Islam as a whole. So part of the style of Kadyrov's politics, which is important to note here, which follows from this, is that in some ways he is sycophantic for Putin in terms of the way he offers his personal praise of him, but there's also a kind of aesthetic overlap in which he emulates Putin's role as a sportsman. He is a kind of family values figure. He maintains a cult of his father, who was a mufti, he was a cleric, who was once a rebel against Moscow, but who converted crucially in the early 2000s and went over to the federal side, bringing people with them and then managing to defeat his rivals, bringing them under Moscow's control. So this is a crucial kind of symbolic relationship, which he uses to solidify his role, his essential importance for the Kremlin. But in doing so, he does this in a way that's a certain kind of masculine posture. He's a patron of the mixed martial arts. If you guys are mixed martial arts fans at all, you know that the big stars, or many big stars now, are from the North Caucasus, from Pakistan and Chechnya. So he has positioned himself as a patron of all those professionals, and crucially of the shock troops fighting in Ukraine. This is really the kind of staple of Chechen media. His deputies are on the front line, those he calls his brothers, some of his relatives, but crucially Kadyrov himself is not fighting on the front line, although he kind of poses as if he's in some proximity. So one conclusion to draw from all of what I've offered so far in this very brief survey is to recognize that the Kremlin accords Islam a relatively privileged position among Russian institutions. It is below the Orthodox Church, of course, but it's still a valued extension of state power. And here in images like this, we see the coupling of Orthodox and Islamic figures. Here, seated side by side to symbolize a kind of interreligious harmony and peace. And in various public meetings, you'll see when Putin appears before a large crowd, these figures will appear in the first or second row, right? There'll be the rabbi, there'll be, of course, the representative of the Orthodox Church, but this is meant to show that there is a kind of parity among these groups, even though, of course, Orthodox Christianity is supreme. So in this context, going back to one of the claims that people have made about Russia's Muslims, given this relatively privileged status, I would argue that Russia's Muslims have not really succumbed to becoming cannon fodder in the sense that it's been claimed. Obviously, all Russian armed forces are cannon fodder in the hands of Russian commanders. Some areas like Buryatia have probably been singled out as being more expendable than others. But I think if we look at Muslim figures, and this is from Media Zona from the first year of the war, and I have a figure coming up next after a year and a half. I think what's revealed is that there's a wide variation. Obviously, the capitals, Moscow and Petersburg, have mostly been spared, right? This is a question of political clout, of class, of political access, right? But if one looks at the geography of war, those areas closest to the fighting have suffered some of the highest losses. Again, places like Buryatia, some of the poorer areas have paid a higher price. But what's notable here, I'll just highlight two regions for you, which is most relevant for us. Chechnya here in Dagestan, Chechnya had lost 173 casualties supposedly in the first year of the war. Dagestan, 416. And you'll see these numbers are much lower than, say, Kuban or Chelyabinsk or Yekaterinburg or Buryatia. And if we look a year and a half in, the numbers are higher, of course, but they're still relatively in the middle or low compared to other areas. And here, I've not circled the key figures for a year, but just Chechnya and Dagestan are highlighted, of course, from here. But Orenburg has nearly as many casualties as Dagestan, and almost 3 times more than Chechnya itself. So Chechnya has been celebrated as this great vanguard of the anti-Ukrainian war effort. But these figures raise questions about the extent to which they've actually been on the front lines fighting and dying. So again, this is kind of a rough sampling, and this accounting, I think, is among the more accurate available to us, but it doesn't account for different sizes of populations. So, for example, Tatarstan and Bashkortostan are figures with fairly large casualty numbers, but they're also massive states. And for Bashkortostan, it's especially interesting because the population there is among the most multi-ethnic of any administrative regions in Russia. So those numbers don't necessarily conform with Muslim casualties, right? Because you have, and then within Bashkiria, among the Muslims, you have multiple nationalities. Then you also have, of course, smaller populations. So it's quite messy. But I think the punchline that I'll offer to you is that the Chechen numbers are quite low. Even in Dagestan, the numbers are lower than many. So again, the claims about Muslims being distinctively targeted as cannon fodder, I think, are inaccurate. Again, because of this relatively privileged position, I think that the Kremlin has been quite careful to shield Muslim communities because they are wary of provoking broader resistance, and they want to keep open these external avenues to influence global policy. So this is a long way of saying, to return to one of the claims about kind of the decolonization of Russia, is that these are not communities that are ripe for so-called liberation, as some have claimed they are, in arguing for the fragmentation of a defeated and decolonized Russian Federation. So we've surveyed the landscape of Russian Islamic politics. Let's turn to our 3 groups briefly to understand how they are trying to make sense of the war. So the first one is really the most straightforward. It is the official clerical view. We've already seen part of this. We have at one extreme the Chechen Vashiev, but just to quote a few lines from some of the others, Talgat Tajuddin has been very careful to simply cut and paste from Kremlin talking points justifying the invasion, with the occasional conclusion of a chronic citation. More interestingly, Kamil Samigulin here on the left has asserted that Ukraine is controlled by neo-Nazis, and argued that these Ukrainians have harmed Ukrainians of all confessions, including Muslims. So here placing Muslims as victims of Ukrainian authority, but also looking externally, looking to the global community and pointing to what he calls Western double standards relating to Libya, Palestine, and Iraq. So this is a more complicated argument than we see with Tajuddin. This is not just looking at the kind of chronic justification. This is actually thinking about geopolitics and then trying to insert Ukrainian Muslims into the mix as the oppressed here. Another figure on the right, Mufti Albert Kurganov, expressed regret about Ukrainian suffering. And this is, again, returning to the idea that there's a bit of a spectrum here among official claims about the war. And here I think that, again, we don't know what these people say in private, but I think some, just to highlight one in Moscow, has put a greater stress on the need for peace and suffering, and yet he usually concludes his remarks by coming around to the Kremlin's point of view. But Kurganov started here by talking about Ukrainian suffering and noting that that was unfortunate. But he argued that unfortunately, Ukraine had become a staging ground for an attack on our country. He added that Muslims were praying for our president and for our soldiers in Ukraine, regardless of their religion or nationality. So much of this rhetoric is what official clerics have produced in the past, but here the justifications really, I think, stretch across a wider set of issues, ranging from accents on the geopolitical to those having to do principally with Islam. And in that spirit, this one jointly signed text, identified here as a fatwa or religious opinion for March of 2022, is an interesting illustration of the conflation of patriotism and piety. Here, the argument is that defending Russia is a sacred duty. Those who die in this struggle are martyrs, that is, they are shaheeds, they belong to a special category of Islamic law and political thought. There's also a reference, importantly, to 1942, when the official Islamic clerical establishment issued a similar declaration in the context of the Great Patriotic War. And so it's a kind of bringing to bear of history, of Islamic legal terminology, and ultimately concluding with instructions about how to bury these martyrs, these shaheeds, how to wash them, how to dress them, and what prayers would be offered for them in a very explicit enumeration of Islamic ritual. So that was very important early on to coalesce support in a clerical voice for Islam and for the war. The local news, to summarize very briefly, is really about various Islamic practices. It's about charity. It's about donating charity to victims of an earthquake in Turkey and Syria. It's about the collection of food for the poor in Chechnya. It's about the conduct of Chechen forces in Ukraine. And then it's Friday, so it's an explication of what the Friday holiday means. And then in particular about the sermon about the Prophet Muhammad's ascension to Jerusalem, Miraj. So, and here Kadyrov is in the front row, looking very pious, and there's lots of video footage of him in a kind of supplicatory role vis-a-vis the Mufti, which is quite fascinating, but he recognizes that the cleric stands above him in these issues. And then if you go to his Telegram channel, there are hours and hours of Sufi rites and public display of Kadyrov's intense religiosity, his devotion, lots of amazing camera work showing his face always emotively responding to the calls for prayer. So this is one way in which the public discourse of Islam, the war, and of a kind of all-encompassing religiosity defines politics in Chechnya, but it is not, of course, the only one. Looking at the neighboring republic of Dagestan, here, again, returning to the theme of a spectrum of even within the official establishment, a spectrum of views, these scholars pictured here are still mostly, they're very active on social media, very active in receiving questions from the followers, from the pious, but they stay in a different lane, and that lane really is mostly about Islamic law, how to live a pious life, and as this illustration suggests here, which activities will help you get into heaven and which will get you sent to hell. And the graphics are amazing. There's also a sunnier side. I guess the heaven part has there's a nice heavenly scene as well. So I've chosen to freeze the frame with the drama of the volcanic flames of hell. But again, these people have spoken, in support of the war, but they've also, I think, seriously tried to focus on other themes, right? So again, they're not in opposition, they're not dissidents, but they have other priorities. And those are really the kind of day-to-day questions of the faithful and their religious needs. So let's pivot now to the second group, which I'm summarizing broadly as the dissident exiles from the Caucasus, who are in Turkey, some in Europe. It's not always clear, they don't always say where they are. But this group is fascinating because they appear to have a broad following. And this is where I have to confess to the limits of my understanding of a big chunk of this problem, because someone like Abdullah Kosevsky seems to have over 400,000 followers. That seems to be impressive. We don't know how many bots are included. I'm not sure about the authenticity, but he's fascinating because he was one of the figures who came out early on during the first days of the war on YouTube saying Muslims should not participate in the war on either side. They shouldn't fight for Ukraine and they shouldn't fight for Russia. And he does it in the Russian language. So he's from Dagestan. He's a Salafi. Again, has a big following. He mostly speaks about day-to-day, kind of questions of Islamic law. But this was a big deal, and it received more than 336,000 YouTube views within the first 5 days. Broadly, he and his colleagues, who tend to be linked together, they form part of a kind of community of communication, but they're not all in the same organizations. Broadly, to summarize their main views, Russian culture is corrupt. Russia as an empire. Some of these channels actually really dwell on Russian history and the conquest of the Caucasus to highlight that. And to know what has changed, that they've continued to rail against the war. But another feature that has bothered them about the conduct of the war is that it has displaced a lot of people from the capitals who have taken to the Caucasus for various reasons, to Georgia, of course, to escape the war, but also because of some avenues of tourism being closed off to them. Dagestan has been a kind of tourist destination, and it's become a destination in particular for influencers who want dramatic kind of mountain scenes. And so there have been a number of scandals in which women, female influencers, have been dressed in a particular way, have been going to clubs and doing things that these people disapprove of, right? So there are lots of scandals around morals, morality, around dress, mostly around the conduct of women, around their dress and behavior. So they're very keen to critique that. Again, mostly focusing on the questions of Islamic law. For example, Kostyevsky, this is one of the more interesting ones. He had an interesting speech here about, he received a question, can a Muslim wear a Russian jersey, like a Russia football soccer jersey? He said, absolutely not. A Muslim cannot legitimately wear a Russian jersey with his explanation for it. So, no question is too small for these guys, but this is, each has a kind of serious meaning for them. Their audience, I think, is mostly young people. It's Russophone, and I think there have been debates within my subfield about Russian language as an Islamic language or not. But here's clear that if you're a Muslim expert and you want to speak to the broadest community possible, you do it in Russian, right? You don't limit yourself to Bashkir, Tatar, or even Kyrgyz. So a lot of what's happening is that these people are speaking to Russophone Central Asians, and then the diaspora, those who've left, those who are in Europe, and so on. Let's go to the third category of people who I think are in some ways the most puzzling and interesting. And we'll start with the power couple of this community, the Al-Yudinovs, who are husband and wife. He has a clerical background. His brother is a cleric. And she's actually a figure because she's, it's a very kind of gendered presentation. Here they're together in this nice domestic kind of patriarchal thing with him sitting there and she's doting on him, at his side. He is the guy who will teach you how to make $1 million, right? He'll teach you about Islamic ethics and theology, but he also is a best-selling author, right? How to be smart, how to be rich, how to become a trillionaire, right? It's part of his thing. You can attend his seminars in Turkey, right? So here, forgive me, but this kind of grifting kind of element that I think is interesting. It's kind of, which is not unique to this space at all, right? I think doing this through a kind of American lens, it strikes me as quite familiar, thinking about kind of prosperity gospel, which now has become a globalized phenomenon. And here he's teaching his son. This is a method of raising kids. So pedagogy is an important focus of their work. And she has her own videos about how women should relate to children. And here he's rarely seen, in what I can tell, in this kind of pedagogical role, but it's mostly assigned to his wife. But what's striking about this kind of feminization of family roles is that these women are now meant to be professionalized because they have experts to draw upon. So she's one, but she's a skipper. She's an Islamic finance person who's really interesting. But someone like Ayselul Kaliganova is someone who, and Stasny one, are people with psychology backgrounds who, as she puts it here, she's a psychologist through the prism of Islam. So this is a fascinating kind of fusion of different kinds of disciplinary bases of knowledge, which also has a financial dimension because she offers services. You can take her seminars. There are wonderful photographs of her hosting events in hotels in Kazakhstan and Moscow, attended by thousands of women. And so there's a sense of kind of not quite a Ponzi scheme type setting, but a way in which this is a kind of monetized activity that is a way to induce greater piety, but it's also a service for which you should be paid, right? So there's a consumerist dimension. And then the graphics are also amazing. I mean, these are, I think, this is Gulbi Khanum. So these are also exemplars of dress and of how to appear Muslim in modern Russia and modern Eurasia. It's very much about looking a certain way. It's about a certain kind of style, a certain kind of aesthetic. Again, which I think is cosmopolitan, but also rooted in consumerism, and definitely, of course, feminized in a way. But these women are also entrepreneurs, they are activists, they are specialists, they are mothers, and they can train you how to be a better mother. So all this, I think, is really a new phenomenon across the Russian Islamic landscape. And I'll conclude with a younger generation of people, and this another space in which much of this is playing out. And this is again the third sphere of new intellectuals for whom the war doesn't exist, right? So TikTok is a great way to escape for all of us. It was invented for some escapism, but there's an interesting genre. Amina Hanuma is just one of them, but there's a whole world of advice videos addressed to Ukhtishki, which I had to look up, which is actually a kind of Russianized version of sisters in Arabic, or my sisters. So this is the Ukhtishki is the kind of hashtag for sisters. So it's addressed to a Russophone audience, but these are people engaging with things like Muslimanka will be another keyword. It's like female Muslim. So 2.9 million views, which is no slouch, I would say. Trying to measure the kinds of engagement that these keywords then create. But for our purposes, there are a few things going on that are worth highlighting. First, this is I think, again, a world in which there is no war, right? Piety is about consuming, it's about visibility. Arguably, it's subversive in the sense that it's Russia, that wearing hijab is new. Being in public in hijab is an expression, a kind of assertion of Islamic identity. So there's an element of subversion there, but it's also, I think, in political terms, it's also quite conformist, right? And it doesn't engage with any kind of politics of opposition. It's about consuming and appearing, and then kind of style, right? There's a way in which this is about pleasure, it's about enjoyment, and about being seen, in a mass global audience, or at least a fun one. So I've gone on too long, but let me just highlight three conclusions, which I hope will make some sense of this mess that I've shared with you. The first one being that the Kremlin policies toward Islam and Muslim communities since the war began have largely been a success. There are no substantive opposition politics in any Muslim region in the Russian Federation. Most importantly, the Caucasus has remained stable. And I think this is especially important because of its geographic proximity to the front. In short, Kadyrov has done his job, right? The rumors about his death, the rumors about all kinds of instability, but in fact, through coercion and persuasion, he's done his job, and that's been very important. The second is that all these politics are both a blending of coercion, of course, of violence, the potential violence, and of persuasion. And here I would highlight, though some of the arguments may sound kind of farcical or ridiculous to us here in a certain kind of setting, all these politics have drawn strength from the fact that the alignment between the binaries drawn by the Kremlin and those drawn by many Muslim activists themselves in Russia between the West and the rest around lines of gender, family, sexuality, and morality have largely held, right? So one doesn't need to be a Putin supporter to think that the West is immoral, right? One can watch the Quran being burned in Stockholm and see something that resonates in what comes out of the Kremlin and its officially backed Muslim authorities. So in relation to this persuasion element, what's being offered by many of these figures is not an innate conservatism. It is a project of becoming conservative, or kind of reconservatization, if I can say that in English. And as such, it's the work, it's a project, it's a kind of work in progress of what these activists hope to achieve to produce this outlook among believers, that is, it doesn't exist before them. And this, I would argue, represents one of the vulnerabilities of the Salafi opposition in the Middle East, who, remember, come at Russia as this immoral place, a place where Islam is persecuted and where, dancing women have taken over Dagestan. The reason that this is not, I think, captured more attention and gained greater influence is that the Dagestani scholars that they oppose are already on the case, right? They're expending a lot of effort already. They're not lying down the job. They're already trying to run these people, out of mosques, out of clubs. They're already protesting, what they see as immorality and deviance in Dagestan. So there's not a lot of space for these Salafi critics to operate in that sphere. Finally, returning to this last set of figures, the kind of third cohort I talked about, we can't discount their escapism and what that means, right? Offered by the new intellectuals. This is also another dimension. I think this is one that is puzzling. Lots of external analysts have tried to understand why Russian society has not acted more critically But I think there's one avenue which occupies the attention of certain sectors of the Russian population, as it does in other societies, right? This is not unique. TikTok exists for lots of reasons, it does lots of things. It's not just Russia that where we can identify kind of depoliticization at work. Finally, each of the groups we've identified here to identify another factor they have in common is that each brings a kind of localized or regionalized patriotism to how they talk about Islam. So in each of these forms, I haven't really illustrated this completely enough here, but we can return to this later, but really each form of piety that's been on display here is really embedded in complex ways in particular localities and regions. So this is another way in which the Kremlin has benefited from each of these projects, because they do create a kind of architecture of patriotism, which may not be focused on the Kremlin, on Putin, on the war per se, but is grounded in different kinds of localities, which I think translates into acquiescence when it comes to showing up for recruitment, for mobilization, for reporting the war, for going to fight and kill in Ukraine. So the whole host of Islamic affiliations that come with regional and ethnic identifications. So at the same time, as a final thought, I think that the entire landscape that I've tried to map out today really points to the emergence of a quite diffuse network, which somehow enables and cultivates acquiescence. So I've returned that term again. I'm not sure it's the best one. I'm eager to hear alternatives, but really, and within that problem of acquiescence, we have passivity. But I also don't exclude that some of these figures are quite enthusiastic about the war. I think broadly, this is a way of subordinating a certain sector of the Russian population to multiple kinds of authority. In this case, religion plays a key role here. And finally, a very last thought, paradoxically, a kind of skeptical one, for those of us who've studied Russian Islam and those of us who study Russian nationalities over a broad period, one of the challenges that especially Russian intellectuals and non-Russian intellectuals have really been politically in search of for now over 150 years is really the project of becoming citizens, right? To what extent can non-Russians become citizens in different historical epochs, right? In the imperial period, in the Soviet era, and then in the present. And paradoxically and tragically, I think the very prominent role of Muslims in this current war project is really potentially a kind of marker, a kind of turning point, kind of moment in which at last the moment of citizenship has potentially arrived for Muslims, right? And the fact that they are at all levels so essential to the war effort. Again, it's a tragedy, it's a paradox, but it seems to be part of the project of citizenship that's also part of the story here. So I've gone on too long, but thank you for your patience, and I very much look forward to your thoughts, questions, and feedback. So thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
and now we will open the floor for questions. Yes, Brenda.
Thank you very much. I'm curious how, if at all, Crimean Tatars come up in these discussions.
I'm sorry,
I'm curious how, or if at all, Crimean Tatars come up in these discussions, because this is a large group of Muslims who, according to their narrative, have been absorbed into the Russian Federation in 2014. But that also have a distinctive tradition, distinctive historical trajectory, kind of similar to the Chechens.
Yeah.
And I mean, do they just ignore them? Do they have a narrative around kind of integrating them, or like how do they figure in the interaction?
I mean, this is the narrative is quite black and white. It is that 2014 and Russia's annexation of Crimea was a moment of salvation that protected Crimean Muslim Tatars from a bad Ukrainian state, and that in fact the clerical authorities, the important clerical authorities in Crimea were already loyal to Moscow, and those who oppose Moscow are illegitimate. So in this context, in this geography, as in others, the Kremlin was able to establish competing institutions. So to the state, there is a mufti who claims to speak for Crimean Tatar Muslims, who's a Crimean Tatar who, I'm not sure about his family history, but he claims that he represents the whole, right? And that the alternative leaders who've fled to Ukraine or fled abroad are illegitimate. And what's striking here too, and I mean, this is something I learned in the 1990s, was this idea that, Russia's Muslim communities are incredibly heterogeneous, and moments of solidarity across different communities have been quite rare, right? So from the Volga region, Kazan Tatars were among the first to go down to the Crimea and say, we're here, brothers, and we have money for this mosque, we have money for this enterprise. And so they acted as intermediaries between Moscow and Crimea. And that was very disturbing to watch, because it was such a betrayal of solidarity, right? And of the historical legacy of abuse and mistreatment that the Crimean Tatars had suffered. But people came out of the woodwork from all corners to come and basically do the Kremlin's work in Crimea. So they have an argument for it, right? It's very propagandistic, it's very black and white. It's essentially that those Crimean Tatars who are complaining have nothing really to complain about. And there are, to this day, there are roundups and there's police persecution and arrests. And I think the argument that people can get around within this universe is that those aren't protesters who are protesting as Crimean Tatars, who are protesting a legacy of Russian history. They are Wahhabis, they are Salafis, they are deviants. They are propagating an alien form of Islam that's hostile to the state, hostile to us. So they're actually, they're criminal. They're harmful to the common good of the Muslim community. So there's a way of just of segmenting the different narratives to advance the single one coming out of the Kremlin. And that was a very strong. And then but that's very similar to what those same folks have done in Syria, to show up in Syria and embrace the Assad regime and its Muslim backers, and make quite outrageous claims about all the good that Russia was doing there, and really to ignore a bigger history of horrific suffering. So that's why I think that, I guess what I'm wrestling too with, many of us who've written in these fields, we've always seen these communities as the underdogs, right? They've been people who were oppressed by the Russian Empire. And I and others have written about intermediaries who played a more complicated role, but now in the present, these figures have really come forward to do very important work on behalf of the Russian state, maybe on a scale that is really at a new level.
So I guess then, if I'm understanding right, the moment of citizenship has arrived statement is connected primarily to a vision of what citizenship seems not to be the word.
Okay.
Then, right? I don't know. Well, in terms of if you're talking about, the vision of a world where there is no war, a world in which there is no war, and that these influencers or intellectuals are part of constructing that world. I guess what struck me was the resonance of the landscape you're describing with the one that we are struggling to articulate and see, but among Russians at the present moment. So it's a very bleak assessment of the world to which, how to put it, these particular intellectuals or influencers are participating in creating.
Yeah, I guess maybe citizenship is not the proper term. I guess an alternative formulation might be that the war has become an avenue for inclusion, for participation, for integration into Russian politics in a way that had been denied them before. Citizenship is, it's a kind of liberal idea. So in this case, rights mean something different, as Jane Berwick has said more than most about. So perhaps that isn't the ideal term, but I think it strikes me.
I just want to make sure I understood that was the nature of the belonging that you were describing. That it wasn't any kind of. And I guess overall, I'm so curious because you are framing this and you have vast stores of knowledge about where these TikToks are coming from and whatnot.
Thank you, Anne. That's a great compliment.
But I'm really curious about what the lines of influence are. What is the nature of the participation that you're describing? Citizenship, maybe, I don't know, but
You mean from the kind of audience?
You're saying they're involved in this state project.
Yes.
I think I have the following question, because these TikTokers, they are coming not just from Russia, they are from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and they are located also in Turkey and other Middle Eastern countries, right? And so when you're talking about, I think I was a bit like, that's what also I had the same question, how you reconcile them being like beyond these borders with this framework of citizenship, or being now able to participate in the making of or remaking of Islam, Russian Islam.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, I think maybe to clarify, what I'm fumbling toward is something about different Muslim communities being engaged in different projects that they understand as realizing new kinds of Islam, right? Which are not new, but are proper, right? The right forms, right? So the third category of people that I discussed is really about people who are not into politics with a big P, right? They're young people. They want to advance certain kinds of piety.
And grifting.
Not all. some, yeah, but some, yeah. But I mean, why not? Why not be paid for your labor?
So you want to say that their nationality doesn't play a role at all?
Right. I mean, so the market, if we're talking about market politics stuff, so the market is, the only limit is that it's Russophone. So you can be in Istanbul, you can be in Bishkek, you can be in Paris, you can be in New York, you can be in Petersburg, right? So the idea is to speak to other Muslims about the way you think one should be, right? And now there are ways to be that, where you don't have to go to an expert, you don't have to go to the mosque, you don't have to go to the sheikh, you don't have to read a book necessarily. I mean, you can consume social media, you can buy things, you can look a certain way, you can perform Islam in a certain way. And I guess in terms of the citizenship link to that is that I think they're making a claim despite themselves.
That's all I wanted to
Okay,
say.
and for example, in terms of like
that it was hegemonic, sort of, that like we're a little bit getting into the like darkness of the technology.
Yeah, but I think just simply to, I think some of these forms of piety, in that they are public, is a form of politics, right? It's a way of carving out space in places like Moscow, to say I belong, right? Say this is a legitimate form of expression. And behind that, though you may not be in politics, but behind that you have official clerics who come out and say hijab bans are wrong. This local school that banned the hijab is wrong. To be very simplistic, Putin said we can have it, right? Putin said Islam is traditional. Putin said we can have hijab, right? So that's a kind of mutually reinforcing kind of hierarchy, but they're not engaged in the war per se, and they won't like it, right? I'm not accusing them of being complicit with that, but in a way it's a kind of embrace of a space that is apolitical with a capital P, and it's not about big politics, right? It's about what you buy, how you look, how you appear in public, that kind of stuff. So in that sense, it can be geographically whatever you want it to be, and that is that it'll affect. I mean, these people can affect how people relate to Islam in lots of places, right, across a huge geography.
Yeah, and so they want to say because of the nature of their messages, that is not a threat to the state, to the Russian state.
Yes, exactly, right. I mean, the people abroad, as exiles, could be, but I think people are interested in them mostly because of like their ethical teachings. When they go into politics, again, the audience is confronted with the challenge that all Russians have, which is what can we do, right? What can we do in the face of a police state? What can we do in the face of military? So, I mean, they can be nostalgic about the 1860s. They can protest. They can lionize Imam Shamil. But really, what can one do, especially when the Kadyrov regime is so violent and is you have a generation of disappearances, right?
Because I'm asking, because I will ask you later because time. I was thinking about China and the Uyghurs.
Yes.
Yes. So but we have questions.
Sorry,
but Jane, and then we go to the questions online.
Well, I agree that citizenship is kind of a dangerous concept, but I think that, and I've suffered from using it too. But I think that you've made a very strong case for the inclusion argument that the war and the response, at least of your first two categories of mediated people, does enforce a official narrative of inclusion of Muslims in the traditional Russian society. I mean, what is the Russian world? So that's very strong. But as others have pointed out, some of the voices, particularly in category 3, have come from the former republics of the Soviet Union. So not Russia's Muslims, but actually from Kazakhstan, you mentioned, and Kyrgyzstan and so on. So here, I'm just wondering, would you be making as strong an argument about inclusionary politics of the Muslim intermediaries in Kazakhstan, for example, as you are making for the Russian Federation? After all, we've got a big civil society movement, I think, in Kazakhstan, many of whom are Muslims, and really very strongly reacting to the war.
Right. In fact, on the last point, I mean, one of the figures I noted here, Aladinov, was going to hold a seminar in Astana, I think, and people protested it because he made some comment, kind of pro-war comment. And so he had to, he made another video saying, I'm canceling. Kind of, he was outraged about that. But I think I got a clarify. I'm sorry. I think I would. So you have people showing dual flags, but I think for those characters, I think the whole question of citizenship in a different realm, and is another potential meaning of it, problematic though it may be, is that I think especially for these migrant populations, there's a sense like many migrants elsewhere on our planet, right? Whether one is, Guatemalan and a New Yorker or Mexican, I mean, these things are like, I think, imagine if you've been working or going to school in Moscow for 10, 15, 20 years, but you're from Kyrgyzstan, I mean, you're kind of in between by now, right? So I think some of these figures are kind of in-betweeners and they're Russophone. So they speak to that audience. It's not exactly like they're drawing upon the political traditions of origin, right? But they're imagining something into the future. And that future is a Russophone Islamic space. And so, again, they're not addressing politics per se directly. I mean, I think we're reading that in, kind of analytically in a kind of social science sense of, everything's political, right? So I don't see a convergence of civil societies working here necessarily, but I think like people who are extremely kind of in between that are, you can imagine just for example, thinking about this is one part of the bigger project on Islam in different countries. I think that, looking at Spanish speakers who are Muslims, that's been fascinating to watch too, that you have, say, in Mexico, you have Americans, you have Spaniards, you have Argentinians, you have a whole host of people from Latin American countries in Mexico propagating Islam, right? So then does it become Mexican Islam, or does it become a kind of Hispanophone Islam or something else? So I think people are kind of mixing those things. So it's not, so this isn't just about Russia, it's just about not the Russian political space, but it's really primarily for them about, I think, thinking about what it means to be Muslim. In a world in which they're looking, the last clip I should have explained better. So the last clip I think was a kind of an Arabic song showing an interest in forms of piety produced in the Middle East, right? And just kind of aesthetic things like this praise of Muhammad came from Morocco and it's beautiful. So I'm gonna put it in my Tunak video that's also aimed at Russians. So there's definitely a nod toward kind of a global language that these people seek to integrate because it's what they think works best. And that's apolitical in a way, but it's also, I mean, in a more utopian sense, it's kind of pushing at the bounds of national sovereignty and the imagination of a national politics.
So there are two questions from the Zoom audience. So the first one is about salaries for the Muslim soldiers fighting in Ukraine. It is said that large sums of money are paid, which in some poorer regions can be several times a year's salaries. Is this true? And are these sums actually paid out?
So I'm not sure about salaries. I'm not the expert on the Russian military, but maybe a related answer could be helpful, and that is just reading obituaries and looking at trying to follow. Again, I've taken on the task of following a war from afar, and that has dozens of limitations, right? I mean, I'm talking about this in New York, trying to learn about this in California, so obviously one can take that into account. What strikes me is that, in the portrayals of soldiers and their deaths, there seems to be a genuine kind of expression of patriotism, of family relationships that have been affected by the war that I think are some of these figures are, they're policemen, they're people who've been in state service. So there's definitely an ethos in which some of these people had already served the state and were already kind of, I think, invested in that identity as officials, as part of the state system. So it's not as if they were always plucked from the farm and thrown into this role. So I think it's clear that they came, many people early on especially, came from families who were already identified with the military, right? So I think this image that we often see in the West of people being, ripped from the tractor, ripped from the factory, thrown to the front, exists. That's part of the story. But there's also, I think, in looking at, especially in Pakistan, they're kind of military families who've happily sent sons, because maybe, they don't have hostility for Ukrainians per se, but they believe in serving the state. I'll add too, though, I saw a dramatic news clip a few days ago of a group of officials meeting with the parents of people who recently died. And I think the idea was to stage an event in which these parents would express solidarity with these officials. And it was extremely disturbing because the mothers and fathers and siblings were completely distraught. So you got a sense in which this is the staging of an event, which is a failure because the propaganda effect had not been effective. And they were completely, the body language was completely hostile to the officials. They were demoralized, they were distraught. It wasn't, because the Russian media have staged other moments in which you see, mothers who are apparently happy to receive, a bag of groceries, for their son. In this case, this was a very unsuccessful staging. One thinks of how these rights can play out unsuccessfully. So it's definitely a mixed bag. But I think that I think there is, in the North Caucasus, especially around in Chechnya, we have to account for a broad spectrum of responses, I suppose. So I think that you have enthusiasm for war, you have a sense of military duty, and I think as a military, many militaries, you have the pressures of men signing up because other men are doing it, right? They're already policemen. There's a kind of an institutional kind of pull that operates wholly separately from what one thinks about Ukrainians or Ukraine or questions of a Russian world.
So we have another question. Okay, questions are coming. So maybe we can answer
Yes,
shortly.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you for the lecture. You mentioned that a lot of these Muslim influencers have been used to engage with the Muslims outside of Russia. Have you seen any response from non-Russian Central Asian Muslims to that? I ask because a lot of the Muslim influence examples you showed remind me of some videos I've seen from Muslim Americans, especially about hijab, halal food, Islamic knowledge, etc.
Yeah.
It's about response.
Great. Yeah. Very briefly. So I think this whole universe is really highly globalized, right? So many of the Russian media channels that appear to get a lot of attention are actually voiced by translators. The content is from London, right? So so what I'm talking about the phone is actually, some of it is actually occurs in translation. So I think what's occurring, broadly, this is a simplification, but I think, people are turning to the internet to have questions answered, right? And they're doing it in languages that they can understand. And so producers are repackaging what they find compelling in other languages. And some of the graphics are definitely from Arab countries that I've used that are simply, stamped with some Russian text. So there's a kind of a cross-fertilization of different kind of directions, which, a certain kind of scholar would try to classify them according to different legal schools and different kind of currents. But I think this is happening so quickly and so spontaneously that it really is almost a kind of, if one thinks in the Catholic context of a kind of cafeteria Catholicism. This is kind of cafeteria people selecting very in idiosyncratic ways from different traditions to receive answers for what is most pressing in their imagination about the best way to live a Muslim life.
Okay, so next question. Someone replied about salaries that salaries above the regional average, especially in Ingushetia or Dagestan, but at times there is significant delay in receiving payments. When it comes to the money for a soldier's family, in case the soldier passes away, these payments often disappear despite the contract. Well, okay, so next question is, has Kadyrov's active participation in the war affected his role as Russia's unofficial liaison of sorts with the Middle Eastern and Gulf states?
Maybe that would be up to the Gulf states to answer to see how this is viewed. I think that I mean he's one of many intermediaries in terms of foreign policy. I'm not sure he has a particular appeal abroad, or as much of an appeal as people with proper scholarly credentials. But I think, watching, I mean, the demise of the Wagner Group and Prigozhin, I guess it's focused more attention on the relationship between Putin and Kadyrov. And it's been very curious to see people speak of Kadyrov as a kind of competitor or replacement for Putin. I think that's a misreading of their relationship. One is clearly subordinate to the other. I would just conclude by saying, it's, at least in the context of North Caucasus, Kadyrov has been very effective in keeping any opposition under wraps. And, it really kind of, if you look at the news clip, the video clip, how it's so striking to have a woman, a presenter in hijab, to have kind of panoramic view of the city in which you have, religious symbols, mosque, and then a new skyscraper suggesting kind of modern financial hub of Grozny. And if one remembers what Grozny looked like in the 1990s, it's quite amazing. I mean, it's kind of a, again, highly propagandistic, highly stylized representation of Grozny. But I think that, I think this was, for many Russian domestic policy observers, what Putin managed to do through the Kadyrov family in Chechnya was really a hallmark of Putin's reign in terms of turning civil war and a really anarchic situation into a place that can now be offered to an outside world with all of its problems as a kind of model of development, and is really quite amazing, quite striking, and I think speaks to the resilience of the Putinist system, but also, again, I tried to draw some attention to the fact that in thinking about a system, we're not talking about one man, right? I think you have this cohort of Islamic clerics who are crucial pillars of the broader system. And Kadyrov is more important than the others, right? But I think that the system relies upon local intermediaries and representatives of all kinds, right? Not just here we focus on religious leaders, but we can talk about people in finance and in other kinds of institutions. But in this, I think that the clerics are so interesting because they do make a moral claim, about things like patriotism, about belonging, about ethics, about morality, about gender relations, about how the family is structured, about widely encompassing, themes that have been historically very much Russian politics, right? What has received attention. So I think they're at a very important position at a time when, the Russian Orthodox Church status has been made more problematic because of its relations with Ukraine, because of those politics. In context in which, Russian society, like others, is probably growing more secular broadly, right? But in this case, we have the reinvention of new forms of Islamic piety, which is going in a different direction, which is so fascinating. So a long answer is to say that, I think that the Chechnya stands out, maybe not in the Middle East, but for a Russian audience looking to the Middle East, they imagine Chechnya as a shining example and a kind of badge of success and an indication of really the logic of keeping existing policies and people in place, right? So an argument against any kind of fundamental structural change in the system.
Yeah. Maybe one more question and then we will finish.
Great.
There are more questions? Okay, so can I ask question? Maybe just you don't need to answer this. I just want to pose this question because I was thinking about the Uyghur suppression in China, and I was wondering if you compare the Chinese case with the Russian case, then can you say that can you agree with the statements of, for example, that the Russian state has been more successful in mobilizing its Muslim population for the state policies,
Very short answer. Yes, of course. I mean, I think it's been much smarter to co-opt, right? To work through, to make intermediaries of Muslim elites. It doesn't mean that those they claim to lead always follow them, right? But it's much more effective in terms of integrating them into a polity than giant prison camps, right? And persecution and all kinds of abuse. That's not to say that Russian authorities have not done some of those things, right? They have engaged in horrific human rights abuses, obviously in the Ukrainian war theater, but also in Caucasus, on and on this daily basis, right? But broadly, the pattern of kind of absorption, of acting as patron, policing on the margins, but broadly serving, acting as a patron of these institutions and people is a much smarter, a much older imperial policy than what the Chinese state has done recently in Xinjiang thus far.
Well, in case of China, it's also old tradition.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but it's like they got off the rails recently.
Yes, yeah.
All right, so
Yeah,
thank you so much
you very much.
wonderful talk, and thank you for
Yeah.
coming, everyone. Yes.
Thank you all very much.